Well, welcome everyone. I gather from the site that some of you are continuing to file in electronically, so to speak, and that's a-okay. My name is David Stebbin from the History Department in the Law School at Ohio State University, and this is the latest in the two-year-long seminar on democracy in a time of change and challenges. And my job, before handing it off to Professor Robin Judd, who will introduce our speaker, is just to say thank you to the various groups and people that have helped make the seminar and this session possible. And so we have seminar partners, the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability at Ohio State, and its director, Mike Neblo, provided valuable financial support for the series. The Webster Center for the Arts, and especially Webster Center staffer Alana Ryder, which is co-sponsoring the series this academic year. To the Melton Center for Jewish Studies at Ohio State for helping publicize this particular session. And the parent organization for all of this, the Center for Historical Research at Ohio State, CHR, and its director, John Brook, who has helped in countless ways. And thanks also to Laura Seeger and Christine Adams of the OSU History Department for help in administering the series in various ways, and to Clara Davidson of Arts and Sciences Technology here at Ohio State for helping sort of get us started with the webinar format that Professor Rosenblum and all the other speakers have been using this year. And last but by no means least, thank you to Robin Judd, my colleague in the History Department, who was the source of the idea of inviting Professor Rosenblum. I went to her and asked, who would be good about this, and Robin suggested Professor Rosenblum, asked him to come, and has agreed to introduce him today, and also to field the questions at the end, because there might be too many, and Robin will use her expertise in European history to sort of organize them if they sort of overlap. And so with that, I will hand it off to Robin, and Robin, you are on.
Thank you, David, and thank you for all of your work in organizing this incredible series. We often have the great pleasure of introducing scholars whose work we admire, and for me, it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to introduce the work of a scholar who I've known and admired for nearly 30 years now. So Professor Warren Rosenblum is a professor of history, and he's chair of the department at Webster University in St. Louis. He's the author of the really wonderful and provocative Beyond the Prison Gates, Punishment and Welfare in Germany, 1850 to 1933, as well as a number of essays in European history. He's currently writing a book on the history of the feeble-minded in modern Europe, and he will be a Fulbright Fellow in Belgium, beginning hopefully with COVID's permission next month. And today he will be speaking with us on the current state of democracy in Europe, populism, and the crisis of expert authority. Before I turn the floor over to Professor Rosenblum, let me remind you to please post your questions in the Q&A feature. You're welcome to do so as Professor Rosenblum is speaking. So with that, Professor Warren Rosenblum, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin, for that really kind introduction. And thanks for bringing me to Columbus, kind of, sort of, virtually or otherwise. And David, thank you. I really enjoyed visiting David's class, and you guys really have some wonderful graduate students with some really brilliant questions that got me thinking differently about populism and the essay by Jan Werner Müller that we read. So with that, I guess I'm going to share my screen and pray to the lords of technology that everything goes well. I have the pleasure of being on leave right now, which means that I have not actually done a PowerPoint in so long. And most of my Zooms have been with family. So anyway, this is very exciting for me. Robin, I'm guessing everything, like you can see my slides, otherwise you'd be.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, okay, great. All right. So I want to start with going back to an event that I'm guessing everybody was as affected by as I was, which was the January 6th riot on Capitol Hill. And a reporter for the Washington Post was in the crowd with a videographer, and she had a number of very disturbing moments where she was accosted by people in the crowd. And for sure, the absolute strangest moment of all, from my perspective, and in some ways the most depressing, was when she was accosted by a man with a heavy German accent who described himself as an East German and compared the Washington Post to what he called the Stasi press. And if I can, I'm just going to give you, this is a 13-second clip. So it's incredibly brief, but also I'm guessing you might just be able to hear the sound, and you may not, if you don't see the picture, that's okay. Make sure you get the sound at least. So this is the man accosting the Washington Post reporter at the Capitol Hill riot. So that was really it. We had the Stasi news doing exactly what you're doing. People got to.
Warren, for some reason you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, there's no more videos, so this should be a straight shot. You can hear me now, I guess, right?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. All right, sorry about that. So, what's particularly distressing about this from the perspective of a Europeanist is here is a man who is evoking that moment of extraordinary joy back in 1989 when the people of East Germany, and maybe he was among them, he sort of almost seems to suggest that he was, the people of East Germany were heroically marching in the streets against an oppressive system. They were attacking the East German press, rightfully, as being a tool of the Stasi or the state security. And they were ultimately, with the admiration of the world that was watching, they were ultimately leading a peaceful revolution that represented the decline of an oppressive system. And here is this man evoking that moment when he is participating in a riot objecting to what we all, I would assume, agree was a free and fair election, and in particular accosting a member of the press who, whatever you might say about the Washington Post, they really did their best to report on the findings of experts that the accusations of election fraud were simply false. And the Post, in fact, did their own reporting demonstrating the charges were false. And here's this man, here's this East German accosting the reporter and asking her, how does she look at herself? How can she deal with these lies on top of lies? So I find this a very haunting moment. And it raises a number of questions, which I'm guessing many of you have been asking these questions in one way or another. Which is to begin with, why is this man convinced that the election experts and the entire legal system, which functioned exactly the way we would have hoped it would, the entire American legal system, which I believe had 61 cases, 60 of which, is if the papers are true, were ruled against the Trump team and in favor of the idea that the election was free and fair. Why does this man believe that none of these experts can be trusted? And a related question, why this intense disdain for the media and this sense of certainty that the media is complicit in a great lie, a great cover-up. And then finally, I guess at the risk of sounding somewhat xenophobic myself, you inevitably kind of ask yourself, what is this guy doing there? Like, just why is he there? Why is this East German, this man with a heavy East German accent, involved in this violent assault on the Capitol? And even assuming for a moment that he was a citizen like any other, perhaps he's been a naturalized American, but obviously his presence in some ways draws us away from the kind of narrow American ethno-nationalism that we associate with the Trump rioters. In this short 13-second rant, he's even introducing a little bit of cosmopolitanism. He's doing something that Trump supporters generally don't like to do, which is he's comparing the United States to another country. And obviously, in this sense, he's presenting himself as almost an international freedom fighter. You can almost for a moment maybe let your imagination run wild and think maybe he just came here to do this. Maybe he came here, probably not true, but imagine that he came here to protest. And on some level, the gentleman made me think of Andrew Zimmerman's work on the German freedom fighters from the middle of the 19th century who came to the United States fighting on the side of the Union after having protested and fought in the revolutions of 1848, that he at least wants to take that mantle, right, of the international fighter, not just on behalf of American democracy and American constitutionalism, but in the name of a higher truth. Well, in this talk, I'm gonna delve a little more deeply into the European context of this revolt against experts, this notion that there's maybe an international battle for truth against a clique of elites, against a dominant class of so-called experts who have been controlling the discourse, in fact, looking at every technology. Part of this is that that's where I'm most comfortable. I've only done work on Germany and to a lesser extent Belgium and France, and I'm most comfortable talking in particular about when we get into the period where experts and an expert class was really developing. That's where I've got the most to say, I think, is about Germany, France, to a lesser extent, Italy and Benelux, and looking at the development of this expert class, particularly in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and then getting at the nature of this revolt in the name of truth and against expertise. Also, as part of my apologia for not being truly European, I guess I would say that I feel like right now everybody's talking about Hungary and Poland in that sort of principle of the history as Oklahoma land grab, where everybody runs out to get their little piece of territory. Right now, Poland and Hungary seem to be on everybody's lips for good reason, because those are the places where populism has most dramatically broken through, and we see a kind of right-wing extremism, obviously in power and doing a lot of damage. But the third aspect of my apologia would be that I'm also kind of hoping that in focusing on Western Europe and thinking about both the rise of an expert class, the hegemony of an expert class in the West, and now the crisis of expertise, the sense of a kind of cabal of elites who have stolen away policy from a democratic process, that while focusing on the West, it does ultimately help us understand what's going on in the East and what's going on among people from the former communist territories. And in that sense, I hope that at the end of this talk, I can kind of come back to this gentleman in Washington and be able to think a little bit more specifically about why he is so agitated and why and how he wants us to take seriously the connection between the revolution of 1989 and the fighting for truth there, and the fighting for truth in this moment here. In talking about a crisis of expertise, in talking about this moment of people turning against the expert class, I feel that in general, people have kind of approached this in two ways. One is to talk in terms of cultivated ignorance, and there's even a word for this now. The scholar Robert Proctor coined the neologism agnotology to talk about culturally induced ignorance. So we tend to think about this attack on experts, whether it's the experts calling for us to take measures against climate change, or the experts right now leading the fight against COVID-19, begging us to take that seriously and take vaccinations, et cetera, or the experts on other areas that I'm going to be talking about, like crime or like the economy, that it's kind of easy to fall back on the notion that this is really just an expression of ignorance. And it's bad education, it's the effects of the internet, and it's additionally the kind of manipulations of corporations, people that have a vested interest in continuing this state of ignorance, and that so it's really a reflection of dumbing down. The second way of explaining this kind of outburst, this kind of anger at the experts and rejection of experts at a class, is to say that, well, they're talking about facts and they're accusing people of lying, but in fact, they don't take this seriously themselves. That attacks like this are really fundamentally disingenuous, and that the revolt against expertise is actually just a reflection of good old-fashioned hyper-nationalism and racism, and that they're merely using the questioning of expertise and the questioning of the motives of the experts and the motives of the press, that's really just a tool, that's just a cover for an underlying ideological conviction. You can probably tell by my tone that I'm not crazy about either of those explanations. And in this talk, I want to push a third. And it's the explanation that's offered by the sociologist Gil Ayal in a really brilliant little book called The Crisis of Expertise. And what Ayal argues is that the current mistrust, and this is a quote, the current mistrust of experts is best understood as one more spiral in an ongoing recursive crisis of legitimacy. The current mistrust of experts is part of a spiral and an ongoing recursive crisis of legitimacy. And so Ayala is really asking us to step back and to think about this animosity, this revolt against the expert class historically. And he's not a historian, and he mostly lays this out theoretically, but he gestures to history. And in particular, in his short book, he gestures to the 50s and 60s, where he sees the scientization of politics, as he calls it, governance more and more based on a technocratic foundation, legitimacy not through an appeal to democratic processes, but legitimacy more and more through the prestige and the authority of experts themselves, who promise to be neutral, who promise to engage in risk management in an objective fashion that will serve the general interest. But that in fact, according to Ayal, it's inevitable, it's built into science that these claims will be oversold. And that science ultimately, particularly when it comes to the science of risk management, can never be objective, can never be neutral, can never be apolitical. And so this hegemony of expertise inevitably leads to a kind of backlash, the scientization of the social, as he called it, the scientization of politics, as he called it, ultimately leads to a politicization of science. that people recognizing the limits of science, seeing the absence of legitimacy, that they try to correct the situation. They try to make science more open to public deliberation, and that in doing so, science seems to be poisoned, science seems to be politicized, and so the crisis simply spirals. And as I hope will become clear by the end, I find this really compelling in part because of that notion of the spiral, the notion of this as a recurring crisis, and the ways in which it allows us, I think, to think specifically about some of this history. In particular, I'm going to talk again about the 60s and 70s and this scienticization of politics. And secondly, to kind of diagnose the moment that we're in, which interestingly, you know, as January 6th fades into memory, and as Trump fades into memory, I think actually we are already sort of, with the pandemic, entering a slightly different stage, where the other thing I'll try to say by the end of this talk is that I think things are actually looking up at the moment in Europe. The good news is that populism seems to be suffering in the polls, and populism feels like it's momentarily in decline. The bad news is that if we take Gil Eyal seriously, and if we think about this spiraling legitimation crisis in regard to expertise, that there are very, very good reasons to think that the spiral is going to keep turning and that we're going to be facing another crisis quite soon. So ultimately, I'm going to leave you with a mixed message, I think. Okay, before we get to that though, I want to talk about I want to talk about this idea of the hegemony of experts. As I said, I'm gonna focus on the 60s and 70s. I'm gonna focus on Western Europe. In particular, I'm going to talk about things that that I'm more comfortable talking about, which is the topics of immigration, crime, and public health. And in regard to all three, I'm going to sort of lay out the ways in which I thought during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had this kind of growing scienticization of politics, this kind of locking out of the political process by the scientists, and then turn to the ways in which the current populist movements are reacting against that, and the ways in which they've operationalized this crisis of expertise. As a background to that, though, it's worth, especially for those of you who are not Europeanists, to just point out the sense in which Europe itself, the European idea, the European style of governance after World War II was really stamped by a technocracy. To say that the rule of experts after World War II really had a special kind of resonance in Europe. I mean, if those of you who are Americanists, you know this, it's in some ways true in the United States as well. But in Europe, you know, just having gone through the crisis of World War II, just having gone through fascism and feeling in many ways that the explanation for the success of Nazism and fascism was political polarization, that really what Europe had experienced in the 1920s and 30s was too much politics. And that Hitler and Mussolini took advantage of that, and that in fact now the threat of communism for Western Europe was on the horizon. And so the best thing Europe could do for itself is to kind of be very careful to contain politics. And that is, you know, part of the impulse for this technocratic set of solutions. I would say one of the great technocrats of that kind of post-war moment is Jean Monnet, the Frenchman who really embraced the idea of the post-World War II world as an age of planning, in particular his interests, economic planning, and but we could have chosen lots of examples. We could have talked about Bevin in England. We could talk about Ludwig Erhard in Germany, but all of these figures in this post-war moment are really embracing the idea of experts stepping up, developing plans, creating commissions, sitting down, organized roundtables with the leaders of labor, the leaders of business, industry scientists, academics. And there was really a kind of pride in the idea that you were transcending politics, that we were going to avoid the mistakes of the 1920s and the 1930s by giving more authority to experts. There was a great deal of confidence that the people were going to be perfectly happy with this, particularly as it through the Marshall Plan and through other aspects of their technocratic planning, it did spur eventually some pretty remarkable growth rates and what the Germans still refer to as the economic miracle. And so that helped give legitimacy to this idea of technocracy as kind of the way of the future. This was obviously very closely related to the control of markets, to Keynesian ideas of fueling the economy through targeted investments and through cooperation of labor and so forth. But it also sets the stage for a later collection of technocrats with a very different agenda, the folks that today get referred to as the neoliberals. And there's a lot of people who, in fact, will tell this entire story that I'm telling here, this entire story of depoliticization and this entire story of a revolt against technocracy, beginning with the neoliberals, and in many ways kind of blaming it on the neoliberals. I feel like Enzo Traverso, whose book I just read, which is a fascinating book, where he blames, boy, he does not like Tony Blair, I got to tell you, but he blames Blair and other neoliberals for, quote, the erasure of the body politic, the erasure of democracy by a technique of government. And while Traverso does that in his historical study, one could also mention Wendy Brown, whose really brilliant book on much more theoretical on neoliberalism and its connection to the current fascist upsurge, as she would term it, again, really starts the story with the neoliberals and really sees the neoliberals as, in her words, killing politics. I don't want to go there for reasons that I hope will be clear. Maybe we can talk about it later. I'm not a big fan of piling the faults on the neoliberals in this way, partly because I really think that the technocracy, the technocratic structures are so much older than the neoliberals. And in so many ways, when you look at the diversity of governing styles in Europe, there doesn't seem to be any correlation between more neoliberalism and more undemocratic modes of governance. It seems like they're pretty evenly spread, whether we're talking about countries that have really embraced free markets, or whether we talk about countries that like Denmark or Sweden that held on to a lot of their kind of socialist reforms from the early post-war period. But the main point I want to make here is that technocracy really does have a special kind of resonance in Europe, that it has a special kind of strength. And now kind of turning to my main points and the three big topics that I wanted to jump into, which again are immigration, criminal justice, and public health. And actually, I'm really embarrassed to say, Robin, if you're out there, that I all the technology sitting in front of me, I don't have a clock. So if you could even possibly send me a warning. It's crazy. I don't know how I don't have a clock, but I guess it's because all my things are on share screen and so forth. Anyway, in many ways, immigration was itself in the 60s and the 70s and even into the 80s, a technocratic project, one that was run by a top-down structure, very dependent on expert input, and very much about containing or even locking out democratic processes. Immigration to France has colonial roots. It was initially back in the 50s related to things like repatriation, that is bringing home people from the colonies, especially when the colonies were going to be liberated. It was about rewarding allies, native peoples that had cooperated with the French, and it was about recruiting workers. And in many ways, those three projects, the lines are pretty slippery. in terms of, what exactly is going on when people are being brought in from, or allowed to come from Algeria, from Tunisia, and so forth. But in many ways, colonialism itself was something of a technocratic project. I mean, there were moments, and I think Alice Conklin is somewhere in the audience, and Lord knows she knows more about this than just about anybody on the planet, that there were many ways in which colonialism becomes popular, becomes subject to political shaping, and is a political project, and one that liberals especially are very excited about. But especially in the 1920s and 30s, and then later after World War II, I'd also say that colonialism also had a very strong technocratic aspect, which is to say that it was being governed by direct administration. It was not something where parliamentary debates were encouraged as much as possible. Colonial administrators tried to preserve for themselves the control of policy. But more importantly, when you start looking at immigration in a bigger picture, and you look at Germany, for example, where there was this guest worker program between 1955 and 1973, there is a concerted effort, a very overt effort to keep the recruitment of immigrants to Germany out of public political deliberations, especially in the beginning. This is a project that is fueled by business industry which need workers. It's one in which the government is on board, but actually a little bit ambivalent, certainly worried at the top reaches about the implications of bringing all these non-Germans in. There was a lot of talk as the numbers got bigger and bigger about modifying the system so that to make sure that these guest workers really were just guest workers and that they would be rotated out of Germany. But at these roundtables, at these higher reaches where the deliberations behind closed doors were happening, the business elites were quite insistent that actually the guest workers needed to stay, that once you trained people, that you wanted them there. And to the extent that this does become a topic of public discussion, the government is very careful to make this a curated discussion, to really operate on their terms. They're perfectly happy to encourage xenophobia in the sense that government leaders raise the specter of the need to control migration, but they also always are reassuring in the end, saying that they've got matters under control. And when a law is passed in 1965 on immigration, it captures this kind of disingenuousness of German leaders regarding immigration. On the one hand, the law states that people will not be allowed to settle in Germany if it threatens the interests of the German people. So there's this slightly xenophobic language that's stuck into the law, but the law actually has no teeth. The law, there's really no mechanisms for giving officials power to reject the settlement of migrants. And so in fact, the reality is that you have this unfolding process of mass migration into Germany, with the government pretty aware of what they're doing, and the people as much as possible given these sort of really false reassurances, and as much as possible this is kept from being a broader political discourse. In short, this is a topic that's really left for the experts. This is a classic case of rule by experts with a certain amount of complicity of the press, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Also, on the other hand, the French have their own slightly similar guest worker program with the migration from the French Caribbean under the guidance of the bureaucracy known through the acronym of Boumediene. And again, it's a bureaucratic process. It's a top-down process. It's not subject to broad public deliberation. And similar to the German leaders, the French leaders are happy to make xenophobic statements. De Gaulle very notoriously stated that, of course, these people aren't going to be truly French, even though people from the French Caribbean were French citizens, but when they come to France, when they train to be industrial workers, when the women train to be domestic help, ultimately, there's going to be some, don't worry, we'll take care of it. There'll be a solution, but we're not expecting you to absorb this population. We're not expecting them to be truly French. And the media in this case is also kind of playing along. The German media in the 50s and 60s certainly discusses immigration now and then, but they really do it kind of adopting the narrative of this as an economic program that's good for Germany. We're bringing in workers who are diligent, who are affordable. We're bringing them in carefully. We're keeping them away from, your children, your wives, your daughters. We're making this a matter of a rational project that is economically sound. And so, when the 1 millionth worker famously came to Germany, the Spiegel did a spread in which they celebrated this guy on his motorcycle. There he is, looking like $1 million. And they made this all into kind of just a charming little yarn about how business was bringing in these exotic people in order to help keep German prosperity on track. If immigration was an expert-run, top-down, technocratic project, then that's even more true when it comes to criminal justice, which in some ways you could say has always been technocratic. I mean, certainly in the case of Germany, they were famous for having commissions of justice reform that would be formed out of experts in the law, experts in psychiatry, medicine, sociology. And these commissions would get together periodically. There were various drafts of the German Penal Code, which involved these famous meetings. I think similar things happened in France. And they were reported on in the press. Germans were very proud of these commissions and the level of expertise that was being brought to bear on the difficult question of crime. But it was not considered so much a matter for public deliberation. It was not so much opened up in the sense of being a problem like any other, with political implications and with important policy decisions that should be effectively left to the people. If this was true before World War II, it becomes even more true after World War II, where there's concern with the way that the Nazis abused justice, where the thought was that justice was politicized by the leaders of the Third Reich, and that the best thing we can do to make justice once again humane and sane and effective is to give experts even more power than they had before. And so there's a lot of very self-conscious efforts to insulate the criminal justice system in the 50s and 60s. And as there's a new reform movement in the works that culminates in Germany in 1976 with the passage of a major penal reform code, again, this is really a top-down process driven and handled almost entirely by experts. In the case of Germany, I would put the stress really strongly on the ways that they reformed criminal justice with an eye towards the dignity and the honor and the ultimate goal of social integration for criminals, for offenders. You could in some sense say that they really took, that they borrowed from the ideals of risk management, that this was sort of a risk management approach to crime, that we should be de-emphasizing guilt. We shouldn't be thinking this so much in terms of retribution against wrongdoers, but that we should be thinking about what's ultimately best for society. How can we create a well-functioning social system, knowing that crime is going to happen? Crime is just it's a risk like any other. It's like a flood or a storm or what have you. It's going to happen. How can we organize our welfare, medical, and policing system in order to maximize outcomes and distribute risk effectively? Their answer was the development of shorter sentences, alternatives to incarceration, more humane prisons, more treatment rather than punishment. and all, in a sense, with a focus on solidarity with the offenders. The image of the offender was a fallen German, was somebody who, you know, had come upon hard times and for various reasons had entered into this lifestyle. And what was important was to kind of bolster their dignity, to restore their sense of honor. And, you know, in some ways we today, I mean, I know some other historians have emphasized, you know, elements of harshness, growing harshness within the European penal systems over the last 30 years. But I'm always struck by the fact that, you know, you compare European penal systems, not just Germany, but also France and other countries today with the United States. I mean, how can you not be just, you know, immediately struck by, number one, the extent to which their penal system is much less harsh and much more humane, frankly. But also it gets to the next point, which is the ways in which their penal system has been insulated from politics. That when there's a moral panic in Germany and probably elsewhere in Europe as well, that when there were these moral panics in the 1970s and the 1980s about crime, that never translated into an actual initiative to take back the criminal justice system. And now part of this is too that criminal justice officials, unlike in the United States, are not elected. You don't elect judges, you don't elect prosecutors. But part of it is too, is that this rule by the experts, this reform project under the guidance of the experts in Germany and elsewhere, had also won over the press. And there were some important connections too. The press was under legal obligations to respect people's privacy, to respect people's dignity. You can't just report on crime in Germany the same way that you do, say, in the United States. You cannot sensationalize crime in the same way back in the 70s and 80s. So in the same sense that, you know, immigration and before that, economic management were becoming more and more technocratic, were being, you know, taken away from the political realm. We can say that too about this project in criminal justice, and in many ways getting even less attention than the other two. I mean, you know, I think Germans took some pride in the humanitarian aspects of their justice system. You probably all know that the Germans and other Europeans are very condemnatory of the United States in this regard, and what they see as the monstrosity of our death penalty and the harshness of our penal system and the continuation of shaming sanctions in the United States. But, you know, mostly people didn't pay all that much attention, and criminal justice was kind of off doing its own thing. Nobody was worrying too much about whether punishments were too soft, whether they were too soft on crime or too harsh or what have you. And the last area I want to mention is public health. And here, you know, French historians have handed us the most extraordinary picture, I think, of the hegemony of medicine, just the prestige and the power of medicine in conjunction with the state, really over the course of much of the 20th century. You could say the same thing, I believe, about Italy. And both Italy and France, you know, build up very impressive healthcare systems, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. I think the Italian national healthcare system dates to 1978. And these were very impressive, very efficient health systems. The World Health Organization called France and Italy number one and number two in terms of the success of their health systems. And this is built on a kind of pride in technocracy, a kind of pride and willingness to give real authority to doctors over matters of public health, that these shouldn't be, a lot of these are not topics that should be left to democratic deliberation, but that in the spirit of, you know, heroes like Pasteur in France or like Robert Koch turning over to Germany, that doctors really kind of earned a special right, and there are very good reasons for, you know, leaving it to the doctors to make important choices regarding policies of public health and management. Maybe in some ways this just seems completely obvious. I mean, who else is going to run public health after all, except the doctors? I mean, unless you're in the United States, where we turn public health into whatever official just happens to wander into the room. But I think we can all agree that we like having doctors, for the most part, making important decisions about how to handle the dangers of tuberculosis, the possibility of another pandemic and epidemic, what kind of measures should be taken to protect children from outbreaks. But because of what's coming in terms of the revolt against expertise, I just want to sort of underscore how profound this hegemony really was. And I think you do see the tensions between doctors as administrators of public health versus the possibility of more public participation when you get down into the weeds and you look at something like vaccines, okay? Because in the United States, in American history, in English history, in the history of just about every country in the world, you do see these moments where there's pushback against mandatory vaccinations and an extraordinary outburst of hysteria or well-organized political campaigns against vaccination. And what's interesting is that France and Italy, two countries that I'm going to come back to in a minute to talk about the problem of vaccination, France and Italy were really kind of models for being able to have mass vaccination policies without pushback. That the success of the medical establishment in controlling this process, in setting the frameworks, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, was almost uninhibited. Those are the countries, one could say, when you look worldwide, I mean, and this isn't my opinion, this is reading some stuff on public health, that Italy and France really were kind of models for handing authority over. Okay, so all that on, and I know that's kind of ridiculously broad in the sense of handling three very different public policy topics and handling a very broad period of time and handling a bunch of countries. So I'm doing all the things that historians probably shouldn't do too glibly, and here I am being a little glib. But my point is to set up the fact that Europe really succeeded in many ways. By the time you get to the 1990s, that Europe had succeeded in pushing politics out of policy in major and very important areas, and that the expert class is not just an invention of disgruntled populists. There really was an element of an expert class. There really was a way in which doctors and lawyers and engineers and economists in industry or in academia, alongside government agencies, that they really did have a very special kind of authority, that this authority was based on a kind of internal logic, the prestige that comes from having journals and peer review and all that nice stuff, of course being credentialed. And also something I haven't talked about, but that maybe is obvious, is that there was a very international aspect to this expertise. In every one of these areas, immigration, criminal justice, public health, the experts are talking across national borders. These are very transnational efforts. Public health, of course, needs to be transnational. And we're seeing that now with the pandemic. You can't, effectively fight an outbreak without also at least having some communication and some sense of coordination of policy with other countries. When it comes to pharmaceuticals, that of course by the 70s, 80s, 90s is very much an international industry. Doctors are trained internationally. They're talking to each other in Brussels about policy. That's also true to a lesser extent, but still very much true in criminal justice. And immigration had the international aspects of setting immigration policy were becoming more and more important. In 1951, you have the Geneva Convention on Refugees, which sets certain terms about migrants that you have to accept, right? And then later with the EU, eventually you have the Schengen Agreement in 1985. But between those 2 points, between 1951 and 1985, you have all these other ways in which immigration is framed as an international issue. There's international expectations, there's international knowledge, international expertise that's being brought to bear on this topic. So all of that, in a sense, is part of this expert class, that it is, it's about evading politics, it's transnational, and it is, I think, maybe this is a loaded word, but there's a complicity with the media. The media and the expert class are, let's face it, they're scratching each other's back. And there's, a certain sense in Europe in particular, I think this is less true in the United States, that, the media really is kind of expected to be a little hush-hush about some of the flaws in this grandiose system of risk management. And there's genuine limits on how much the media can, challenge the expert class. Well, when it comes to populism and when it comes to the revolt against expertise, there is nowhere better to start than with Italy, because in many ways, this extraordinary movement, and it looks like a political party, it kind of smells like a political party, but it's not. They're very insistent to be called a movement. The movement known as 5 Star really captures in many distinct ways the revolt against the whole kit and caboodle of rule of experts. And I think no single individual captures that better than the leader of the 5 Star movement, Beppe Grillo, who, in case you don't know, is himself a comedian. This is a movement that rises up in Italy around an entertainer. And I'm not sure if he's a good comedian. I've really, if anybody can point out a good Beppe Grillo joke, I was trying to find one. I have the suspicion that he's actually a really bad comedian too, which kind of adds insult to injury and how this guy could become such an amazing political force. But in any case, Beppe Grillo, pictured here, builds this movement around events, very much about gatherings, and that in fact really even eschews the media. They don't want any media coverage. They want to have direct communication with the people behind this movement. And so Beppe Grillo organizes these kind of extraordinary confabs where there's singing, there's joke telling, there's lots and lots of speeches, but they're very much around generating a political enthusiasm that is in opposition to the entire realm of the expert class. A lot of the energy that Beppe Grillo manages to mobilize has to do with anti-vaccine feelings in particular. And very quickly, in fact, he starts in the mid 2000s, and the movement grows very, very rapidly into the late 2000 teens, and it's also a time where anti-vaccine sentiment, both in Italy and in France, is really accelerating in a way that just takes doctors by surprise, takes the government by surprise. One very depressed Italian medical leader says that with people denying the vaccine in the way that they are, that Italy is quickly becoming Namibia. And apparently, in all seriousness, the rates of vaccine hesitancy, as they call it, the people that are refusing to take regular childhood vaccines, was comparable to Namibia. So he wasn't just pulling that out of a hat. In explaining this opposition to vaccines, people very quickly reach for a couple scandals and a couple newspaper articles. They talk about the infamous Wakefield study from England in 1998 that had claimed that vaccines were causing autism. They talk about a 2013 court ruling in Rimini, Italy, in which a judge awarded damages to a family who claimed their child had developed autism as a result of the MMR vaccine. French commentators similarly talk about scandals in France that broke out. There was a scandal involving tainted blood. There was the scandal involving the swine flu vaccine, a bunch of scandals. All this is used to explain why the French and the Italians were turning against vaccines. But none of these explanations really make sense by themselves because they beg the question of why did these scandals have such resonance? Why did the Wakefield study, which after all comes out of England and was quickly repudiated, why did that have such extraordinary influence in Italy? And I would submit, borrowing again on the work of Gil Eyal, that it's no accident that there's kind of an inverse relationship between the success of the medical establishment in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in sort of insulating itself and in setting the terms of medical policy. There's an inverse relationship between that extraordinary hegemonic success and the revolt that we're feeling and seeing today. That it's really exactly what Eyal talks about, that in this moment when there's a challenge to the claims of objectivity and to the claims of a kind of perfectly functioning neutral risk management system, that the medical establishment kind of tries to correct itself, kind of opens up the door to broader discussions, and then very quickly science itself seems to be poisoned, polluted. Science itself suddenly seems to be politicized, and the entire system just looks like a fraud. It seems to be exposed as corrupt. And one of Beppe Grillo's, brilliant moves is to make these kinds of, he's always making connections. He's a very good conspiracy theorist, but he looks at the discussions and he notes the way that industry is playing a role, and he's asking who's benefiting from these vaccines. He's looking at the way that the occasional bad reaction to vaccines is being suppressed and is not being discussed and is not part of the discourse. And he's saying, who's doing that, who's behind that. And so there's this kind of ability of this rising populist movement, the 5-star movement, to kind of build off of this a deeper suspicion about the rule of experts. 5-star grows and grows. Largely, as I said, they avoided the media, but they really embraced the internet, and they have a kind of direct relationship with their public. And there is, for a moment, there was kind of a question of, does this movement ultimately go left or does it go right? Who really benefits from this movement? And what's clear is that the movement very easily lent itself to anti-immigrant feeling as well as this anti-vaccine movement, that having kind of built up these levels of distrust towards the establishment, this feeling that medical experts were in cahoots with each other and were locking out the people from their ability to deliberate and adjudicate on these questions, that same kind of animosity very easily transferred to immigration. And in the case of Italy, you had another party originally known as the Northern League. Today it's just called the League, which couldn't be more different than 5-star. It was much more overtly hostile to immigration from the very beginning. It was basically had a very kind of racist undercurrent. It was very much about Northern Italy setting itself off from the South. They started off with actually being very concerned with the issue of turning Italy into a federalist country so that Northern interests would be protected against all these slackers from the South. But what's interesting is how 5-star and the Northern League were able to collaborate and able to ultimately actually come to power together, and that the issues that they cared about very quickly became overlapping. The Northern League embraced anti-vaccine, and in fact, when 5-star and Northern League come to power with Matteo Salvini as the deputy prime minister, but deputy prime minister with extraordinary power, one of the things they do is they completely change the vaccine laws to allow people to skip vaccines and not be punished, not face any sanctions. And so while on the one hand, the Northern League becomes anti-vaccine, on the other hand, 5-star becomes more and more of an anti-immigrant movement. as well. And where they both really can dance together is on the topic of the European Union, where they both started building up a very strong Eurosceptic core, calls for either actually withdrawing a sort of Italian Brexit from, or at least, loosening their ties with the European Union. The other thing, I thought I had another slide here, but I don't. There's kind of a similar process with the German party known as the German Alternative, Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD. They also start off as a very narrow focused party concerned with the European Union. In the case of AfD, it's actually a bunch of economists who start the party and are narrowly focused on questions of, especially after the crisis of 2008, 2010, and the sovereign debt crisis. They're concerned about Germany supposedly paying too much, giving too much away, being trapped in these agreements and bailing out the Greeks. But they very quickly and almost seamlessly in Germany, the AfD goes from being an anti-EU party to being an anti-immigrant party. The same kind of distrust of this expert class, the distrust of the ruling elite, seems to transfer really easily, particularly among the rank and file. The folks at the top of AfD were actually a little bit shocked by how quickly the party moved. It happened in 2015 when Angela Merkel announced her willingness to accept as many as 900,000 Syrian refugees. And for many, many people in Germany, but especially within the AfD, this was one of those moments where the experts exposed themselves as illegitimate, that they very quickly decided, without any deliberation open to the public, very quickly decided to open the doors to these Syrian refugees, that they seemed to be doing it for reasons of winning over other countries in terms of Merkel really wanted to kind of be the sort of model country for dealing with the refugee situation, living up to old treaties, old promises, and old principles of the refugee obligation towards refugees. And among the rank and file of the AfD, there is this just remarkably fast movement and flooding into the AfD as being a standard bearer for anti-immigrant sentiment. And the leaders of the AfD are actually in many ways caught flat-footed. They are sort of, one could say the revolution really ate its children. In this case, a number of the original founders leave. They're quickly replaced by a woman who is much more a creature of the movement. She's actually herself an educated chemist, Frauke Petry, who then becomes leader of this now more focused anti-immigrant party. And then she herself is, within a remarkably short period of time, is kind of shunted aside as the party continues to get more radical, as the party continues to kind of take in more and more factions with their own kind of anger at the system, their own sense that in so many different ways, the experts have been lying, the system is fundamentally guilty, is fundamentally distorting, and one faction after another changes the kind of character of the AfD. And if the first generation is swallowed up by the move to being an anti-immigrant party, the next generation of leaders, or at least in the case of Frauke Petry, one very important leader, is swallowed up by this turn towards an ever more kind of radical base, an ever more chaotic movement from below. John McCain famously, talking about Trump, referred to Trump and his allies as firing up the crazies, that they had suddenly opened the door to all of these right-wing elements that for years the Republican Party in the United States had been keeping at bay. And there is a sense in which the AFD, the Five Star and Northern League movements, but also the new leadership of the Front National, the National Front in France, likewise, it's easy to jump into this narrative of firing up the crazies, that they sort of identified a new possible base of support, that they saw an opportunity to to gain this kind of energy from these very extreme groups that were out there. In the case of Germany, there were actual neo-Nazi groups. There's Pegida, which was a party that had been founded that was really quite overtly racist. In the case of France, you have Generation Identity, which is a group that is kind of embraces violence and is pretty overtly racist. And one of the things that seems to be happening in this moment of revolt in the late 2000s, mid to late, you never know how you use, being a historian, I'm not used to kind of using shorthand for these years, but the mid 2000 teens, this period of, especially after the Syria crisis and the mass influx of refugees into Germany, one of the things that these leaders are doing is they're, in McCain's terms, firing up the crazies. But I want to say that I think the populist phenomenon and its relationship to these more extremist factions is really much more complicated. That in fact, what's striking about all of the populist parties at this moment of growing revolt is how they are distancing themselves from the old languages of extremist parties. In the case of Marine Le Pen, she distances herself quite dramatically from her father, getting him kicked out of the party. She changes the name of the party from Front National to National Rally. She launches this whole program that she calls de-demonization, where she's going to try to remake the party as being much more mainstream and capable of working and being accepted by other parties. And doing all this while at the same time opening up the tent and allowing in these various factions, which is a little different. Obviously, it's a different way of putting it than saying that she's, or any of these others, are firing up the crazies. And the reason I think this distinction is important is because it's essential to the brand of European populism that they are opening up the door to counter thinking, that they are the tolerant parties. They are the ones who are willing to allow, as the Germans call them, the Querdenker, the oppositional thinkers, the counter thinkers in through the door. And that the reason they're doing this, the reason that they're letting in the crazies, if you will, is because of the walls that these experts have built, because of this gigantic oppressive system of experts, and that the only way you can defeat the expert class is by opening up this door to a breath of Querdenker, a breath of counter thinking. And so that's a very different way of considering the situation of these parties, that this is less about, sure, if the crazies are willing to support us and the crazies are fired up, okay, well, that's great. Sure, we'll take the support from Pegida if you're AFD. We'll take the support from the Génération Identitaire if you're France. We'll take the support of whoever shows up. But that's not the point. The point is that we are tearing down the walls. We are taking on this very oppressive, dramatically powerful system of expertise. And in order to do that, our brand has got to be that we're the ones who are the taboo breakers. We're the ones who are, open to creative thinking, and that everything should be on the table. We are, and this is something we see in our own country again and again, from the right, is, we're the ones who are against political correctness. It's the left who, it's the universities now who are spending their time shouting people down and policing discourse. And we on the right are the ones who are opening the door and allowing for, alternative forms of thinking.
So Warren, since
Yeah.
since you mentioned shouting people down,
Yes.
that seemed like a great moment for me to tell you that it is 4:40. So I had sent you a little chat. So
Super. Okay, thank you.
to
Thanks.
wrap up.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Robin. Yes, that was a good moment. And a voice, a disembodied voice comes and shouts us down like this. Okay, so moving a little with that warning, moving a little more quickly, what's also striking about these populist parties is just as they moved easily from being, anti-vaccine and against this oppressive public health system to being anti-immigration, they can also move very seamlessly from being anti-immigration to being anti-crime. And obviously those issues are connected in the sense that the anti-immigrant movements have a tendency of associating immigration with disruption, with terrorism, with social danger. And over time, they're really transforming the image of the criminal per se. And they're destroying that idea of the criminal as this, figure with whom we should have solidarity, who we should, be offering dignity and honor so that they can eventually be, integrated, because, this image of the immigrant as criminal and the criminal as immigrant is, of course, one in which any kind of rehabilitation and integration into the white-dominated society is, at the very least, much more problematic. And so populism then very easily slides into a kind of pronounced opposition against that 1970s, 1980s reform project. Pretty much all of the populist parties have become tough on crime parties. This is part of their war on taboos. They say over and over again, why aren't we talking about immigrant crime? Why aren't we, focused more as if people weren't talking about immigrant crime? Of course they were, but the point is, as in this slide that you see in front of you from a German group, where they say vertuscht, covered up, that 46,000 Germans have been victimized by criminal migrants, and hey, we're not talking about this. This is, by the way, all complete nonsense, but these are the kinds of campaigns that are at work. And this opens up a door as well, along with having the internet at your hand. This opens up the door for sensationalizing individual crimes the way had been done in the United States for decades. While German newspapers still are limited in being able, they can't name names when it comes to crimes. There's that protection of the privacy of even a convicted criminal offender, let alone an accused criminal offender. But these German groups are able to use the internet. They're able to sensationalize criminality in other ways. And in France, you see the kind of politicization of killings, particularly the more gruesome terrorist killings, like the recent beheading of Samuel Paty, which led Marine Le Pen to call for war legislation to fight Islamism. But the point being that, again, this just fits so seamlessly into that narrative of an expert class that for decades had sold European peoples down the river by, their loyalty to very internal legal discourses, their own, kind of self-congratulatory languages of humanism, and their international societies, their conferences, their expectations, the infiltration of United Nations human rights principles into local laws, which the populists see as, just like they do in the United States, as being somewhat monstrous. Why are we beholden to human rights principles that we didn't ourselves come up with, but that are, coming out of Geneva, or maybe they're coming out of the European Court of Human Rights. But there's this hostility as well to human rights as something which, ties the hands of local justice systems. And so, so this too, crime too, becomes a kind of third area in which all of these parties are able to mobilize along with immigration and along with public health. I said that I was going to kind of end on a mixed note, and there's sort of a bunch of things happening at once that I kind of want to at least allude to. One of them is that there is a very significant uprising in Europe against COVID-19 measures. And once again, it's sort of questioning the authority of experts, their loyalties. It's accusing them of tyranny, and it's doing this in the name of democracy. On the left, you have a picture from the assault on the German parliament, which fortunately was not successful, but this happened before the assault on the American Congress by a group actually calling themselves the Querdenker, the counter thinkers. And on the right, you have an advertisement for an event by a guy who actually left the Rassemblement National in order to start his own party, and apparently hasn't been all that successful at it. But here he's borrowing the word rally against confinement, and also trying to kind of generating this anger. They've had mixed results with this. On the one hand, the passions are very, very high among the people who are fighting COVID-19 measures across Europe. It's been a serious source of very angry mobilizations. On the other hand, as I mentioned at the beginning, their numbers that's not translating into winning at the polls. That in fact, it really seems to be the case that there's a broad decline in support for populist parties. The AfD, after having achieved something, I believe it was 16%, they became the third largest party in the 2017 Bundestag elections, and now they're down to something like 11%. That's pretty good news if you don't like populism, and if it's not clear, I don't. The Rally National in France is obviously better in the sense that they're a major party and they are challenging Macron. But given all the mistakes that Macron has made, given the weaknesses of Macron, you would have expected, I would have expected the Marine Le Pen's RN to be farther along. Five Star and Northern League in Italy, after having been in the government, then were tossed out of a government. Now they're back in, but they're in a much more minority position. So there too, populism doesn't seem to be doing all that well. So in so many ways, I can end on a positive note in that I think European democracy is looking better in this moment than it did a year ago or a couple of years ago. But I also think that this book that I keep mentioning by Gil Eyal really points out exactly what we have to be watching out for, which is this sense of the cyclical process behind these crises of expertise. And that what happens is exactly in moments like this, where you've got a pandemic and you've got a majority of the population, at least in Europe, rallying behind the establishment, looking to doctors, looking to science to answer their questions, even looking to the European Union and being happy that there are transnational efforts going on to protect them in this moment where there's a kind of crisis consolidation of power. It's almost inevitable that there's going to be this backlash, that there's going to be this challenge to exactly the claims that the medical establishment has been making, this overselling of their own neutrality and objectivity and ability to engage in risk management. And so, we shouldn't be surprised when there's a new kind of, perhaps, let's hope not, but perhaps even more fierce crisis of expertise and attack on the scientific establishment within, a certain amount of time. That the people that were storming the Reichstag and the people that were rallying against confinement measures could well be getting a lot more traction very soon. And then last but not least, where I promised to end, back with our friend on the steps of the US Capitol, and this question of, what does all this have to do with the people that were living under communism? And, why might an East German, or for that matter, somebody living in Poland, or somebody living in Hungary, or Bulgaria, or these other Ukraine, these former communist countries, why might this kind of crisis of expertise and this explosion, this slow-moving explosion that happened particularly between 2015 and 2020, why might that be of profound importance to them?
Warren, I'm just going to give you we have only 10 minutes left total.
Yeah.
So if you could conclude quickly so that we could move on to the questions.
Absolutely, yeah, and in fact, I'm really done. That, you know, my last point is just that these that if you read the book by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes about how the West, you know, sold its model to the East, and how much of the legitimacy of democracy and democratization in the former communist countries was based on this European model. That for the European model to now be in crisis of this nature necessarily echoes back on people that have lived through communism. It now feels like what the West was offering is exactly the same thing as what they'd suffered through under communism, which is, of course, exactly the message that our German friends started us off in. And thank you. I'm sorry about that, Robin. When you said 440, I mixed up.
No, thank you. It's all so interesting and thought-provoking. And of course, it felt quite Hegelian, right, of thinking about what we do in terms of these cycles. There have been a couple of questions, and they're quite different from one another. I don't know how much time we'll have to get into them, but the first was it's quite interesting. How do we take into account the heterogeneity within Europe when we try to kind of imagine these crises of legitimacy? Can we actually compare, let's say, Germany and France with something like Greece? So how as historians and social scientists, how do we do that kind of work?
Yeah. Yipes. I was expecting I was going to be called out on how I've ignored the Eastern Europeans. I wasn't expecting to be called out on the South, which is like, it's the problem with doing Europe, right? There's always some new angle. No, that's a great question. I do. I know nothing about. I know so little about Greece. It's embarrassing. I think part of the reason that Ayal's argument appealed to me was exactly the ability, though, to generalize when kind of moving one's eye around the continent. And so, you know, I do think that in the case of Greece and the rise of I don't even know how to pronounce it, but Syriza, the left-wing populist movement there, that you can tease out some similar kinds of moments of this kind of spiraling legitimation crisis, that, you know, the ways in which Greece too, comparably to Italy, found itself kind of investing their hopes in this expert class, this very international class that was supposed to kind of help them work with the EU, and that was going to, you know, ensure a kind of equitable management of the Greek economy. You know, Greece and Italy and Spain have all this in common, that they are very polarized between, on the one hand, a kind of expert class that really does kind of almost fit the stereotype of these Eurocrats, these kind of local politicians who spent a lot of time in Brussels and who are kind of, you know, really have their European chops. There's a lot of those people in Greece who seem very, you know, almost seem like caricatures of the European elites, and are cut off. Their entire legitimacy is really based on this selling of economics and of a kind of this idea that there is no alternative, because, you know, we've studied the numbers and this is how it's got to be. And so I think, you know, it's possible to apply these sorts of this, you know, model of the spiraling legitimation crisis there as well. Although obviously, you know, in the case of Greece, they were kind of hit by this complete storm, which was the sovereign debt crisis, you know, all at once. But I do think I'd be cautiously optimistic that it allowed, that's really exactly the point, that he's kind of opening up some paths of comparison across national borders.
Great. So the questions are sort of coming on and fast and furious. One kind of more narrow question is, do you think, I guess I shouldn't add, that Macron is holding the line in France, given kind of his attack on French universities is an attack on science?
Right.
So
right.
Do you see him, and perhaps let's expand it to some of the other questions that have been coming in. Do you see other politicians across Europe moving increasingly to the right?
Yeah. Those are great questions. I mean, I think Macron is not that he's not about holding the line, really. I think it's kind of the opposite situation as in Italy and what I alluded to in Greece, in that where those countries are so polarized between the kind of unapologetically Eurocratic people and then the populists on the other hand. In the case of France, Macron is clearly trying to steal thunder from the right, and I think he's done that for a long time. He's a little bit of a populist himself, right? I mean, he's not quite a taboo breaker in the way that Sarkozy was, but he is somebody who came in wanting to reinvent French politics and reinvent the party system, and he definitely prides himself on in some ways being a wrecker, and so it seems to come pretty easily to him to sort of borrow from the language of the right, the language of the RN, and that's exactly what he's doing with that horrific story about the universities, and it's also with a lot of his language on laïcité, on secularism, and he's really just seeing this as a contest between him and Marine Le Pen, and he's just trying to cut her off at the pass and steal. And I guess he's assuming that people on the left and even the center left just have no choice. I mean, they've got to support him no matter what, So he's playing a bit of a dangerous game. It's very crudely opportunistic and political, but I guess he's hoping that somehow when push comes to shove, that he's, in terms of substantive policy, that none of this is going to be too meaningful, that this really is symbolic. That at least is what giving him the benefit of the doubt. The man is not a conviction politician. So I do think he's kind of a natural born opportunist and plays the role very well. And so I don't know if that in the end, does that mean a shift to the right? Does that mean Europe is moving right? I'm not sure. I mean, I think, look at, and the other thing is he's probably borrowing from the Merkel playbook. Angela Merkel is such an amazing figure in her ability to survive and her ability to kind of borrow just enough from the opposition to, make herself seem like the inevitable choice. And at the same time, in terms of policy, in her soul of souls, she's very technocratic. She's very much a scientist. And I kind of wonder if that's not what's going on in a lot of places, that they're gesturing to the right in order to, really, I mean, there's no question there's amazingly nervous leadership elements in Europe. I mean, they're so frightened of populism. They're shocked by the rise they're still traumatized by the rise of the AfD as quickly as it did in Germany, in the same way that I think Americans were traumatized by Trump's victory against Hillary Clinton. And so the main thing they're thinking is, how do we stop this from happening again? And how do we keep from having a French Trump or a German Trump? I do think they're being very, very calculating about the effort to just avoid the deluge. It's après moi le déluge.
So perhaps we have at least time for one more question. And that is that you identified a number of, I think, really important categories for our analysis, right? Vaccination, crime, immigration. I'm wondering, and this won't surprise you, if you could speak to the relationship between populism in Europe and the presence of religious minorities, which kind of crosses over some of those categories, but is not itself the same thing. So what is this relationship between populism and religious minorities, and how does that play out in this crisis of expertise that you're describing?
Yeah, wow, that's great. I think that's an area where it really does, maybe this sounds like a dodge, but I think that's one of the areas where the distinctions between countries are really important. I mean, there's laïcité in France is such a distinctive discourse. It's so hard to compare France with any other country when it comes to how they handle just that problem of Islam in their minds, that it's a problem, and how do you navigate that ideal of secularism in the face of a religion that wasn't part of the original deal, as opposed to Germany, where in some ways they're, a little more relaxed, perhaps because they accommodate, state religion much more. And then there's so many countries in between, so I do think it's really, really hard to generalize. And I guess I didn't do this consciously, but I probably pushed the topic of religion out of this presentation, for that reason, that I do think it's deeply, deeply complicated. And it's fascinating to think, thinking out loud about the question then of expertise. France does have this kind of collection of experts, some of whom were telling the French people, don't worry about Islam. It's, terrorism has nothing really to do with Islam anyway. It's just, it's a movement that's kind of borrowed Islamic cloak. And then you have other experts telling you just the opposite. And it would be interesting, I guess, to plot that out. But again, they seem so different country by country. I mean, Germany just doesn't worry about religion in the same way. And on the other hand, the populists, the AfD, like the Rassemblement National and like the Northern League, they are nervous about Islam, and they want to, there's one of the policies that crosses borders is the desire to have mosques regulated, to insist that the imams have to be trained in country, and insisting that the Quran needs to be trained. Some of these like really crazy proposals, those have been in all of the countries mentioned, so clearly the populists are borrowing from each other and are demonizing Islam in exactly the same way. But on the other hand, I think in terms of the effort of the managerial class to address the challenge of diversity and how to deal with the religion, I do think that country by country is just so different. It's already making my head hurt trying to think of it.
Well, maybe that's the right place and time to end. If your head is hurting, I apologize that we weren't able to get to all the questions either.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I talked for
Q&A or that people were sending to me. This was really quite wonderful. John, do I hand the floor over to you and David, or do we just thank everybody and go think about this question of kind of rethinking why it is and how it is that we are in the place that we are?
Well, we could field one or two questions from the Q&A, but I know that you do have to go. So
okay, so then I will hand the floor over to John, and he will continue.
Right.
Thank you, Robin.
Right. People are probably hitting the road, but there was a question about the attack on the Bundestag, and the question about what the odds might be if it happened again. Could it happen again after the general elections in September?
There was an enormous backlash against that attack. So it's, that's one interesting thing. It's interesting that, it almost connects to the question which wasn't asked, which is how they all responded to the attack on the American Capitol.
Right, yeah.
Because people, even in the populist parties, at least overtly, were appalled by the attack on the American Capitol, and the reaction to the attack on the Reichstag has been extremely negative. So that might even be an interesting kind of defining moment. I can't think of I looked at everybody's Twitter accounts, and the denunciations of what happened in Washington were quite dramatic, and it's not the same in Germany because they didn't succeed, but I really didn't see any expressions of sympathy. And so saying that, I really do think no, it ain't gonna happen again. I think that, this phenomenon that we have in the United States of armed men walking into state capitals is also something that is, fortunately, just doesn't strike a good chord.
Right. Well, the whole question of a turning point. Certainly in this country, January 5th, January 6th, set a margin, and then January 20th set another margin. And the paper today is talking about Trump voters who are broadly agreeing with Biden policies. And so we have a phenomenon which was sort of predictable, that if Biden could pull, it's still not finished, but if Biden could achieve his ends, they have populist dimensions in the sense of getting things done for people. And take a little bit of the juice out of the movement. So I don't know how that even can work in Europe, but it's you can see the first glimmers of that unfolding in this country.
And that might be a good note to end on, John, in part because it's optimistic. So, but also because we are beyond our time by about 5 minutes late on a Friday afternoon, and we do have another event for Professor Rosenblum. So we'll sign off for now. Just a little bit of shadowing. There will be 2 more seminar sessions, both in April. So next will be in Brazil, and then there'll be the concluding keynote, and you can look for these. If you Google Democracy Seminar at Ohio State, you'll find a way to see the exact dates and descriptions of those events. So thank you for attending. And again, thank you, Professor Rosenblum, for doing such a great job.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.